Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining another episode of A Voice from the Margins. My name is Ajamu Baraka, and I thank you again for joining us this evening. I am really excited tonight. I have one of my favorite folks who has joined us this evening to enlighten us on a number of issues related to the world. But before we get to that, and before I introduce our host, introduce our guest, that is, I've been moving around the country for the last few weeks, as many of you know. I'm in Jackson, Mississippi this evening, heading out to a big event out in Lincoln, Nebraska, organized by the green activists out there who are mobilizing to bring attention to the issue of climate justice in this country and really around the world. There's a lot of good work that's taking place, a lot of good organizing, a lot of energy out there. I mean, there's a lot of folks who are really emboldened by the new period and believe that with all of the difficulties, we still have some real possibilities of doing some and engaging in some very important political work here in this country. And I really feel good about that. We're going to connect up our understanding of what's happening domestically with what is unfolding in the world. And we have someone with us who is uniquely qualified to help us in that examination. Eric Draitser is a geopolitical analyst. He is the individual that when I'm getting ready to do a interview and I have to update myself very quickly on a topic, I don't go in and pull up my stuff. I go straight to Eric and look at one of his articles and get all the information that I need to get ready for that interview. Eric Draitser is the host for Counterpunch Radio and also Stop Imperialism Radio. He's as I said, a geopolitical analyst. He has been on a number of different outlets. And he is here with us tonight on A Voice from the Margins. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thanks, Ajamu. Much too kind.
So we want to get right into it. We only have 30 minutes, as you know, and a lot to talk about. You and I had a conversation a few days ago, and we didn't get a chance to really dig into some stuff, and we had a whole hour. But one thing we did talk about was, in general terms, we want to talk about, the Trump foreign policy and what all this means in terms of an issue that we're both concerned about in terms of imperialism. But before we get into that, can you give us, our listeners, a quick understanding when we talk about these terms and we talk about a term like imperialism? How should we be thinking about this term?
Well, I think there's really two ways of looking at this, and both of them are valid and both of them are important. One really is from the theoretical perspective, and that is part of the education process for really, in my view, anybody on the left, anybody interested in imperialism, anybody interested in the functioning of modern capitalism really needs to understand how imperialism works, the implications of the system of imperialism, and so forth. Now, I think probably the foundational text is Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. That really, I think, forms the bedrock of our understanding of what imperialism is, how it functions, and how we should distinguish between, regional powers versus empires. How do we make a distinction? What are the criteria by which we examine whether a state is currently an imperial power, has imperial ambitions, or so forth? So there is a theoretical framework with which we can examine the issue and understand it. But I also think that for many people, and sometimes just in our political work, we have to get out of the books and we have to apply our understanding to our contemporary situation, to the times that we're living in. And so rather than saying, well, just go read Lenin and you'll understand imperialism, another way to look at it, and this is kind of the second version of this I would propose, is just understanding how imperialism functions today. What is it doing? What does it look like? And a very short, concise definition, as concise as I can make it, would simply be that imperialism is the global political and economic and military architecture that has been constructed by the United States and its regional proxies and its allies around the world that has essentially created one cohesive global system of hegemony. And that is, I think, what modern imperialism really looks like. This is not exactly 1914, where you had competing empires fighting over colonial possessions, leading to a global conflict. The situation is much more complex, and yet it's much more interlocking, interrelated, and interdependent. And so to me, when somebody says, well, what does imperialism look like today? It is a system, a global system. It is not the United States. It is not, Saudi Arabia. It is not any of these countries individually. It is the way in which all of these different interests overlap and intersect in order to create one cohesive, functioning system of hegemony. That's what imperialism looks like in 2017.
Fantastic. And full disclosure, Eric was also part of Team Baraka during the campaign. He was my advisor on international affairs. So we wanted to throw that out also. So
again, much too kind.
So Eric, you talked. Thank you for that definition, and you used the term coherent, cohesive a few times. One of the things that you and I talked about the other day was whether or not there was in fact some coherence in the Trump administration, their foreign policy. And we know that, as you laid out in your definition, the U.S. is at the head of this global system. And one of the main responsibilities of the president is to, in fact, manage that global process and to maintain U.S. global hegemony. And we know that both parties are committed to this. We know that they are being guided by their strategy of full spectrum dominance. But what we talked about, and we may have had some disagreement a little bit, was whether or not there was any real coherence in this Trump administration. I was making the argument that it was a continuation of the kind of confusion and lack of coherence we saw from the Obama administration, engaging in fact, counterproductive policies. You had a different take. You said there was an underlying sort of thread of coherence. Talk about that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I think that there is. And I want to back up just a brief second and just say that I don't think that this is an either or question. I don't think that the Trump administration is totally incoherent or completely coherent. I think that there's probably both of those things working. But I think that it's a dangerous assumption to simply, go ahead with the assumption that, well, the Trump administration, they really just don't know what they're doing. They're bumbling their way through all of this. And, it's like, let's watch Nero fiddle as Rome burns kind of thing. And I don't think that that's the case at all. And in fact, if you look at some of the actions that the Trump administration has taken in the last, month or so, from my perspective, it's very easy to see it as incoherent, as bumbling, but I don't see it that way. Let me just give one example to explain what I'm talking about. You take a look at Syria. The Trump administration, Trump sends, 59 missiles to Syria, allegedly attacking, a military installation, an air base that may or may not have had, functional equipment and may or may not have been particularly important for the Syrian military. And one can say, well, look, he achieved nothing. It was obviously just a PR stunt, and that's it. But I think another way of looking at that is to note that Trump essentially made a move that cost him nothing. It cost him nothing internationally, and and not only did it cost him nothing domestically, it boosted him up. It totally made people forget about the question of him being illegitimate. It totally made people forget about a number of scandals, even if it was only for a brief period. And most importantly, it put Trump in a oppositional relationship with Putin and with Russia, and forcing Russia's hand. Because again, what has Russia done over the last last year and a half. They have presented themselves as a major part of the war in Syria, as a backer and supporter of the Syrian government. And here you have the United States launching missiles, which essentially cost the U.S. government nothing, forcing Putin to do nothing. And now it raises the question in the minds of the Syrian government, in the minds of the Iranians who are also involved in Syria, how much do we trust Russia? How much do we trust whether Russia's really got our backs? I think that this is part of the calculation, sowing doubt within this alliance, creating fissures, creating cleavages, and sort of putting wedges into those alliances. We see the same thing with North Korea vis-a-vis China. The U.S. is essentially continuing its policy of aggression. It is ramping it up, and it is forcing the Chinese into a very uncomfortable situation. Now, I'm not saying that this is a good strategy, and I'm not saying that I want to see anything like this happening. This is incredibly dangerous. But I think it's also dangerous to assume that the Trump people don't know what they're doing. Here's one example. You think they don't know what they're doing? How come Paul Wolfowitz is advising H.R. McMaster in the National Security Council? If we really think that the Trump people don't know anything about what's going on, totally incoherent, why are they taking the neocon playbook and working with the neocons? I think rather than assuming they don't know what they're doing, I think we should assume that they do. And that's the really scary part of all of this, is that they know what they're doing and they're moving ahead with it.
Well, you know, Eric, I think you lay out a very clear and coherent argument. I tend to think that what I'm seeing is a more improvisational approach to foreign policy. And even though, as you said, the neocons are now have their foot in the door and are operating now through McMaster's, you know, you still see these reports of the lack of agreement among the team. I mean, for example, going back to Syria, we know that Mad Dog Mathis and the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and even the general of Central Command, are not really in favor of increasing more U.S. boots on the ground in Syria. But yet, McMaster's, and apparently it seems like perhaps maybe even Trump, are leaning in that direction. So, you know, where is it? It's almost like they are playing this. You know, they have one position on Monday and another one on Tuesday, and so there's just this improvisational approach to it that, you know, we sometimes will then see the activity and apply a coherence and a strategic coherence and focus to it that may not really be there.
Maybe so. I think that's a very valid point. But let me turn it around for just a second and present the counterpoint to that. I don't know if you're much of a baseball fan, Ajamu, or people who are watching or listening, but in baseball, there is a term that we use, like I'm in baseball world, but you know, that is used to describe a certain kind of pitcher, a pitcher who throws fast and who's unpredictable. They call them effectively wild. And what that means is not that they don't know how to throw strikes. It's that the batter always fears that any pitch might come screaming at their head at any time, and thereby keeping them off balance. And that's the term effectively wild as it's used in baseball parlance. And I think that what you're pointing at is 100% correct. But I think that incoherence, that unpredictability, they see as an asset, not a detriment. And I think that that's one of the things that really needs to be unpacked a little bit as we look at the Trump administration's foreign policy and how they're going to continue moving forward. I remember back during the campaign, Trump said he wanted to put upwards of 30,000 troops in Syria and Iraq to fight the so-called Islamic State. Well, that got completely lost in the narrative about Trump the isolationist, Trump the anti-regime change guy, Trump who opposed the Iraq war, allegedly, all of that. But the reality is that Trump was giving us these signals from the very beginning. And I think that we need to really begin to kind of divorce ourselves from a lot of the propaganda and a lot of the nonsense. Trump's tweets do not equal policy. Trump's statements and bloviating about this and that one day and the next, that's not policy. The policy comes in the examination of the decisions that they're taking and reading into the possible motivations behind them. I think that that's what real analysis in the Trump era is going to look like. Obama was relatively predictable. Clinton and Bush, more or less predictable. Trump, I would say, is much less predictable. But that unpredictability, I don't think should be taken for incoherence, at least not from the people who are shaping policy. Trump, sure.
What's the policy then for North Korea?
I think
what is the strategy?
I think the policy is to accelerate the process that's been ongoing for a long time, not only ramping up the military drills, which are annual drills, but actually beginning to threaten North Korea with a real show of force. And the reason for that has nothing to do with North Korea or, South Korea or any of that. It's all about China. This is a way of playing the Chinese into a corner in order to force the Chinese to make concessions in the South China Sea. That's ultimately what this is about. And we should keep in mind that the South China Sea is one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. And who is one of the leading forces shaping policy in the Trump administration? Rex Tillerson, directly out of ExxonMobil. Okay, so where oil has been a central, focal point of U.S. foreign policy for many decades, it's now no longer a focal point, but really one of the driving forces. It is in many ways shaping policy. And so when the U.S. makes a move against North Korea, sure, it's about North Korea and it's about nuclear weapons and it's about China and all of that, but it's also about geostrategic imperatives as Washington sees them.
Before we go to Q&A, and as the time goes by so quickly, I'm going to ask you to briefly comment on a number of hotspots, if you will. 10 seconds or so apiece. Iraq.
Iraq is a war that is being expanded, a war that never really ended. And what Iraq is really about is both a proxy war against the Iranians, but it's also about maintaining that all-important foothold. The United States was terrified that the Russians were going to come in and not only make Syria into their ally, but really make inroads in Iraq. Part of the focus on Mosul is about destroying, fighting infrastructure, but it's also about separating the Russians from Iraq as much as possible and realigning the region to whatever extent possible in the image of the United States. Libya is not only a failed state; it is one of the great tragedies of this century thus far. Libya.
Why do you say failed state?
It is a failed state because it is no longer a state. It is now at least broken up into three, essentially independently functioning regions, controlled variously by Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist groups, also local militias, some of whom are not so nice, some of whom committed major atrocities during the so-called uprising, or what I would call the imperialist war against Libya. And more importantly, maybe most importantly, Libya was the opening salvo in a continent-wide destabilization. Without the war in Libya, you wouldn't have any of those other conflicts. Ukraine is another example where the empire is pushing Russia towards conflict, and specifically for the purposes of creating fissures between Russia and its European allies, trying to break the oil and gas monopoly and trying to divorce Europe from Russia and Eastern Europe from Russia, part of a 25-year process of NATO expansion and aggression.
What spots that we didn't talk about that we should watch over the next couple of years?
Venezuela is at the top of the list. Venezuela is under destabilization and economic and media war right now. I think we should also pay attention to South Africa. Major developments in South Africa around the African National Congress, the ANC. There are major interests in finance capital in London and on Wall Street who are watching that very closely, who would love to get the Democratic Alliance, the DA, the formerly white party of South Africa, into power. Part of that process involves regime change, complicated issue, lots of factors that are not necessarily all that clear, but definitely should be watched.
Fantastic. Now we're going to go to our questions. We have a lot coming in. So I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. So the more concise you can be, Eric, the better. I know it's a lot of stuff. Nicholas wants to know, the American military-industrial complex are the main culprits. Can you talk a little bit about the connection? connection, I guess, between U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. Military-industrial complex?
Well, it's a boom time for the military-industrial complex, for Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and Boeing and all of the rest of them. They're securing major contracts, and they're certainly rolling in the dough with the Trump administration. I think that that is one of the major drivers of a lot of U.S. Aggression around the world. And certainly, it is what Dwight Eisenhower warned against in his final speech before he left office. All of that has come to fruition. So yes, the military-industrial complex drives the empire to a large degree, but it is not the sole driver. And this is one thing to keep in mind. You cannot divorce the military-industrial complex from finance capital and Wall Street. Wall Street and finance capital underwrites everything that happens in the U.S. economy, including the war machine, including every other aspect of the empire.
What is the interest of the U.S. in undermining and destabilizing Venezuela?
Number one is, of course, oil. Venezuela is one of the world's leaders in terms of oil production, and one of the major clients for the United States, or rather one of the major markets from which the United States imports oil. It's also about destroying the socialist-oriented alliances that have grown over the last 15 years in Latin America. Chavez was engaged in a process of unification in Latin America under the Bolivarian Revolution, and they have to break that. And part of the way that they break that was with economic war, but it's also with political sabotage, assassinations, destabilization. All of that's ongoing in Venezuela. And even today, we're seeing further destabilization. Every time you pick up the New York Times or Washington Post, you can see that Venezuela has a target on its back. And again, this is about breaking Latin American independence.
There's a sort of a theoretical question here regarding this notion, the justifications for intervention, and the latest one being the intervention by the U.S. into Syria. And it's the question of this humanitarian bombing or humanitarian intervention that has really kind of linked both liberals and the neocons in some ways. Can you talk a little bit about this humanitarian intervention? Is this responsibility to protect, and how that facilitates, or maybe not facilitate, the continuation of imperialism as you laid out earlier?
There's no such thing as humanitarian war. There's no such thing as humanitarian intervention. There's merely war for interests. As Henry Kissinger famously said, the United States has no friends. The United States merely has interests. And so anybody who's propagating the idea of humanitarian war and responsibility to protect is either wittingly or unwittingly doing a service, a major service for imperialism, and upholding what amounts to the left flank of imperialism. Humanitarian intervention is designed to tug at the heartstrings. It's designed to exploit liberal prejudices about the way that the world works, the white savior complex, and all of those other things that, we could go on and on about. Humanitarian intervention and so-called responsibility to protect is a doctrine created by liberal imperialists in the United States and in Europe in order to justify war without the kind of naked aggression of a George Bush going into Iraq, or any number of examples. It's designed to justify what the empire does under the auspices of democracy and peace.
Fantastic. How do we then explain, Eric, the ease in which the authorities under the Obama administration, of course, and not even under Trump, under Trump, are able to convince the U.S. public that it has a right and indeed a responsibility to respond to a gas attack in Syria, and to basically ignore all international norms, international law, and take the responsibility to, quote unquote, punish the Assad government? How does that happen?
Who's going to stop them? You? That's the real question. That's how they think. Who's going to tell us we can't do that? American exceptionalism is not just about self-image. American exceptionalism is about the right to do exactly what you're talking about. We have that right. We have arrogated that right unto ourselves, and we will then take it to the rest of the world, and we will do what we think is in the world's best interests. This is the mentality of Washington, of the imperialists who are at the wheel of this system. And so, the media plays a a very important role in this. In order to propagandize effectively, you have to create a victimization where the United States will be able to posture as the defender of victims rather than the creator of victims. That is the major distinction here. In order to justify it to the public, they have to feel that moral righteousness is on their side, and humanitarianism and democracy and human rights and all of these other pretexts are merely ways to do that.
What do you've been trying to stop imperialism for quite some time. How do we in fact stop imperialism? If we see over and over again the ease by which the state can mobilize opinion in support of interventions, illegal activities, assassinations, how do we stop this?
The most important thing is to recognize that this is a system, and like all systems, it has its strong points and its weak points. Can we identify what those weak points are, and can we move to exploit them? Can we figure out and map out the architecture, the infrastructure of this system, and find ways to undermine it, to create alternatives to it? So protesting is a very important thing, raising our voices against what the U.S. does. But if protesting is the end-all be-all of our politics, then we're certainly not stopping imperialism or maybe even stopping traffic for that matter. I think what we need to be thinking about is different ways of organizing and building independent political power at the community level, and those communities then coming together at the regional, state, maybe national, and ultimately, of course, the international level. In other words, we have to be able to work simultaneously on multiple fronts. And so part of that means being able to address the needs of the community. Whether if you live in an impoverished community, what are you doing to make sure the children aren't going to bed hungry? What are you doing to make sure that they have, access to books and school and what all the rest of that? More broadly, we have to think about what are we doing to make sure that Walmart doesn't come in here and put these businesses, out of business, these stores and so forth. Are we creating alternatives in our community? Are we building our power in order to undermine that corporate system? There's a very small number of corporations. If you really look at these corporate maps and stuff, there's a very small number of corporations that really do dominate the economic life of the empire. If we find ways to create alternatives that drive people away from them, not out of purely politics, but also just out of self-preservation, if we can do something better than Walmart can, or Samsung or Apple or whomever, well, that's what's going to build our economic power. That's what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi right now. That's what's going on in a lot of other places where they're working to build independent power. That's what's going to, and an independent politics. That's what it's going to take to really undermine the imperial system.
Let's go back to, we're getting a lot of questions related to North Korea. Let's go back to that. Lynn wants to know, do you believe that the aggression towards North Korea might backfire and actually cause a sense of a need for reunification between the North and the South?
Oh, I hope so. I really hope so. It remains to be seen. I don't believe that the United States and its client proxy state in South Korea is going to allow that reunification process, but that doesn't mean that they are omnipotent. If there is enough of a grassroots movement in South Korea, which already exists, we should add, the previous government before the right-wing government took over was actually pretty amenable towards at least something akin to normalization. If we are moving in that direction and it's galvanized by Trump and his buffoonery, then all the better. I do think, though, we should be skeptical because the elephant in the room, of course, is China, and China's relationship with North Korea is complex. It's certainly not straightforward, and it has been strained at times. So the question really is unification something that could happen without intercession from China? I would be skeptical that that could happen, which means China has to be allowed to be an intermediary. Will the United States step aside in order for that to happen, or will they escalate a conflict? I think ultimately that's the crux of the North Korea question today.
How do we counter the propaganda? Eric, we saw what happened. We've seen these various incidents. Jacob would like to know that he pointed out that we had the stories of the babies in the incubators that helped to mobilize against Saddam Hussein. We saw the horrible pictures from the gas attack, chlorine attack, or whatever that was in Syria, and that was the impetus for the flinging those missiles. It becomes very difficult to engage in rational conversations with the American people who have been propagandized to their very bones, especially when you have those kinds of images. How do we, again, counter that propaganda in the midst of conflict? And I raise that question too, Eric, because there was just something that I read today that suggests that there's a majority of or close to a majority of the American population that is in support of this outrageous proposal by the Trump administration to increase the U.S. military budget by $54 billion. Speak to that for us.
Well, there's always going to be a segment of the population that will support anything that is camouflaged and clad in the American flag. There is a certain jingoism, and there has been in this country for centuries at this point. For the entire life of the country, and certainly sort of in overdrive in recent years. And I think that points to the we're going back to this word, the cohesive nature of the corporate propaganda system. Let's not forget that almost every media outlet in the United States is controlled by 6 corporations. And if you really want to break it down, it's controlled by just a handful of people. And they're the ones who are directly connected to the policymakers, to the ruling establishment on Wall Street, and the rest of them. They're beholden to advertisers. They're beholden to capital. In other words, our media and our propaganda system, it is a function of capitalism. It is profit driven, but it is ideologically driven in the sense that it is imperialism that they are selling. They are packaging it and selling it just like they are any other product. How do we counter that? Well, look, those of us who are interested in peace, who are interested in social justice, we're never going to be able to match them in terms of the power of our capital, that is to say, financial capital. But we are able to match them and outclass them with our human capital, with our talents, with our abilities. And I think that what that means is, just as I was saying earlier about building an independent political and an economic infrastructure that will allow us to actually challenge the system, I think equally so, we have to build our own independent media architecture or infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, one that allows us to be able to not only counter the narratives of the corporate media, but to also be able to address foundation-funded pseudo-alternatives, fake alternatives, those that present themselves as alternatives, but always end up lining up for war, or certainly war when it's under the auspices of a liberal. I think that we have to get away from that kind of notion of independent media and get to something different, what I would call truly independent media. That is to say, financially independent, politically independent, and focused ideologically. I think all of those things are important, and there's really no way of doing that unless it's you, me, and all of us doing this together. That's what my project is about. That's the media platform that I'm trying to build. And hopefully, if you can take anything from what I'm doing, all I would like to see is other people doing the same thing. Doesn't have to be like what I'm doing, doesn't have to be like what anybody else is doing. As long as you're doing it, you're helping to build our independent capacity. That's what it's going to take to counter the corporate media and the imperial war machine.
Our last question, and we people are really enjoying this conversation. Our last question, again, looking at this concretely in terms of what we can do to mobilize and to also engage in transformative consciousness activity. The budget and this outrageous proposal to increase it by $54 billion. We know that they are involved, or the Congress is involved in a conversation this week to either have a continuing resolution or to have a budget agreement. We've been told that the main sticking point is funding of the wall, but yet what they appear not to be talking about is the fact that the increase in military spending is also part of the conversation, except that we're not really being directed toward that. How do we take advantage, or can we take advantage of this debate to mobilize opposition against this obscene increase in the military budget?
Well, there's really two things happening there. One is opposing this specific increase, and the other is in making people understand. Making is the wrong word. Helping people to understand just how much of a seamless transition we have seen from Obama to Trump, just as there was from Bush to Obama. Trump is not merely expanding the military budget. What Trump is doing is building on all of the expansion that Obama did, and that's the misnomer. Obama, the only reason any funding was ever cut under Obama had to do with the sequester. It wasn't Obama going out on a limb to try to, cut down the military budget because he was interested in peace. Similarly with Trump, he has a political imperative to raise the budget. That's essentially what he ran on, racism and jingoism and militarism, despite the fact that people were pretending like he wasn't. So that political imperative, that needs to be stopped, and that requires working with the broad coalition. That requires getting out into the streets, influencing elected officials, as all of the traditional political tactics. But the other piece that I think is integral here is in making people understand why it is that we're opposing these things. We're not opposing them just for the sake of opposing them. We're opposing them because what they mean for our brothers and sisters in the global South, what they mean for the victims of imperialism, the victims of this neo-colonial system. You take a look at Africa, it is ringed with U.S. military bases. Now, they don't call them military bases, but that's what they are. Every country but Eritrea and Zimbabwe has got a military base or military cooperation with the United States. Latin America is the same thing, increasingly in South Asia. When we're talking about expanding the budget, we're talking about expanding the empire. That's the connection that has to be made. And also, by the way, it's about lining the pockets of the contractors. So you can take multiple different positions depending on the constituency that you're talking to in order to get them onto the same page. Look, stopping this process or halting it and undermining it, this is not something that a small segment of the populace is going to be able to do. It will require a broad movement, one that is, in many ways open to many different viewpoints, but one that is not, and this is the key, and I want to stress this above all else, one that is not dependent on, beholden to, or allied with the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is part of the system. They're part of the system that we're trying to oppose. You cannot ally with part of a system against another part of a system. That's just not the way that it works. So while we want to be broad, we also don't want to be allied to a moribund political party of imperialists and capitalist pigs.
Yes, sir. That, my friends, is our friend and comrade, Eric Draitser. He's a bad brother. And I'm glad that our friends and comrades here in the green sort of world have a chance to be exposed to this, the clarity of this thought, the sharpness of the analysis. Where can people find you to get to follow you and to get more information?
Thanks, Ajamu. One way to follow me is to subscribe to podcast Counterpunch Radio, produced in partnership with the left-wing publication Counterpunch. You can go to counterpunch.org. You can subscribe on iTunes, Google Play Store, many other places. Also, go to my page on patreon.com/Eric Draitser. There, if you become a patron, you can have access to many podcasts. I'm going to be producing a TV series or a series of videos coming shortly, exclusive articles, writing, photography, a whole lot more. So there's you can go to Counterpunch, you can go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, and you can also go to my website, stopimperialism.org.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us. We're definitely going to bring you back. This what we went over, but that's fine because the masses were asking for this, and so we're going to make sure we bring information to them.
Hey, thanks,
so again,
John.
Thank you. And folks, please go to my website. I'm not as dynamic as Eric, but go there and check out some of my stuff, ajamubaraka.com. As many of you also know, too, we have just launched a new Black anti-war formation, the Black Alliance for Peace. Check that out also, blackallianceforpeace.com. We're going to build a movement. We have no other choice.
And by the way, can I just say,
thank you, my friend.
This week, Ajamu Baraka on my show. Check out my show to check out a full conversation for an hour with Ajamu Baraka.
Thank you, Eric, and thank all of you all for joining us again for a Voice from the Margin. See you next week.